do like that mashup of Kim Dissects the Bible and Spiritual Wisdom. Greetings fellow snowflakes. The thing is, I'm not going to do any more Kim Dissects the Bible episodes. They'll just be Spiritual Wisdom, which may include talking about Christianity from time to time alongside the other spiritual and religious things I like to talk about. So I wanted to talk today about the key figure in Christianity, Jesus, and what the hell actually happened there. First thing I want to say is that many of the more miraculous elements of the Jesus narrative may have their origins in pagan myths and stories. Many godlike figures are described as having some kind of virgin birth, not just Greek heroes whose mothers were impregnated by a deity, but also figures in other religions such as Buddha and Krishna. Also, many of the miracles of Jesus seem to have echoes in pagan stories about holy men doing extraordinary deeds. Then we come to the great tradition of dying and resurrecting gods in pagan myths, many of whom had mystery religion cults attached to them. So there was Osiris in ancient Egypt, Mithras, a Persian deity who was also adopted by Roman soldiers, and Dionysus of the ancient Greeks. There are others such as Attis and Adonis. Many dying and resurrecting motifs in pagan mythology are linked to the changes of the seasons. Life-giving gods are depicted as dying in the winter months and rising again in the spring. But mystery religions also grew up around these deities, as the dying and rising motif can also be symbolic of a spiritual transformation, a dying to your old life and rising again into a new understanding. Sound familiar? Many of the details of the myths surrounding these deities might seem eerily familiar to a Christian reader, and it is quite possible that elements of mystery religion myth were added to the Christian narrative of Jesus. Some similarities are not even part of the biblical narrative, but rather part of church tradition, such as the dates of important festivals. Okay, Easter is partly based on the Jewish tradition of Passover, but there are also pagan festivals of spring renewal, and the bunnies and eggs surely come from them. The date of Christmas. The Bible narrative doesn't actually tell us what time of year it was when Jesus was born. The date of Christmas does come from the winter festivities to mark the winter solstice, and it is from pagan sources that all of the Christmas traditions involving evergreen plants like pine trees and mistletoe come from. Of course, another key influence on the Jesus narrative, indeed on the very idea of Jesus, was the idea of a Messiah and the prophecies surrounding his arrival. Messiah means anointed one, and Christ is a literal translation of the word into Greek, and as such it just refers to the anointed king of Israel. Many of the Messiah prophecies in the Old Testament do refer to the coming of a literal king of Israel, not any kind of god, but a man, albeit a highly spiritual, idealized figure. There is something else in the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah, to which I'll come to in a minute. So, did Jesus exist? Or is he simply a combination of pagan god and Jewish Messiah? I've wrestled with this question for many years, and I've sort of reached the conclusion that there must have been somebody at the very root of the movement that became Christianity. Before Paul, there was already a church in Jerusalem. He tells us so himself. There's also enough in Paul's writings to assert that they were followers of a man called Jesus. I think there is reason to believe that there was a Messiah figure that Peter, James and John followed, someone who had a claim to be the King of the Jews, and that people followed him for that reason. There were many such figures during the time of Roman occupation of Palestine, many revolutionary individuals that Jewish zealots would rally behind. It is highly likely that this one extraordinary man focused almost exclusively on being a spiritual teacher and healer rather than a militant revolutionary, which would have alienated some but inspired others. It's possible he was set up and crucified as a revolutionary all the same. It's possible this made his followers heartbroken, depressed and in a spiritual crisis. It's possible that there is a very real historical Jesus hiding within the pages of the Gospel accounts, despite being overshadowed by mythical tales of virgin births, water into wine, feeding of the 5,000 and rising from the dead. But edit out the obviously added elements and someone genuine does emerge. Did he think he was God? Actually, the Gospel accounts conflict with this assessment for the most part. Did he intend to create a new religion? Probably not. Is he who Christians say he was? No. But he existed. There was probably a very real person, a king of the Jews, who refused to revolt in militant fashion, but instead wanted to create a spiritual renewal for the Jewish people. Which leads me to the early church in Jerusalem, the group led by James, Peter and John. What did they believe about Jesus? What was their purpose? There is another part of the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah, where something beyond a real flesh and blood Saviour King is being suggested. I have pored over the Old Testament scriptures, trying to understand what they are saying in those instances where there are passages that seem to suggest something godlike about the Messiah, passages that Christians leap on enthusiastically. I know that there are millions of Jews that also follow these scriptures, who not only dispute that Jesus was the Messiah and reject him utterly, but also have no godlike understandings of the Messiah that is to come. Jewish beliefs about the Messiah are that he will be a king of the Jews, chosen by God, a godly and holy man for sure, but still just a man. So what are we to make of Old Testament passages that seem to Christians like they are predicting a godlike Messiah figure? I've spent a lot of time analysing and trying to understand those passages, and I've reached the following conclusion. What they are suggesting is that there will be a time, ushered in perhaps by a literal Messiah figure, when the Israelites will no longer need a literal king to deliver them, because God will be their king. The whole narrative from Judges through to the end of 2 Kings, when the Jews went into exile, is about how the people struggled without a king, cried out to their religious leaders for a king, and then the kings let down God's chosen people, encouraging worship of pagan gods and leading them astray from the one true God, which resulted in the fall of Israel and Judah and the Jewish people going into exile. Then, in the actual passages of the Old Testament dealing with the prophets and their predictions about a future king of Israel who will deliver the people, it is said quite plainly, in black and white, that the law of God will be written on the people's hearts, and that God will be their king and they will be his people. Some of these passages are quoted directly by Paul in his epistles. Could it be that Jesus was that man, trying to usher in this spiritual renewal of the Jewish people? His followers may have wrestled with the depressing truth that this holy, almost perfect man, who inspired them so much, who helped them experience a spiritual renewal in their own hearts, had been murdered by the state, humiliated and defiled in the worst possible manner, and treated like a common criminal. Had it all been for nothing? It is not beyond reason to conclude that they would have examined their scriptures, found those meanings there, and formulated a faith around God being the Messiah they sought, and a spiritual renewal with Jesus as its starting point. Then came Paul. Paul was at first persecuting this group of Jews in Jerusalem, the first Christians, but more like Jews than Christians from the perspective of what came since. Why was he persecuting them? Well, possibly because he was in the business of aiding the state in rounding up any known groups of revolutionaries. But as well as being a loyal Roman citizen, Paul was also a devout Jew. There are suggestions in his writings that he was zealous for the law, but also that he is deeply knowledgeable about and respectful towards many aspects of Hellenistic culture too. Could it be that he was a deeply conflicted and troubled man, trying to balance his respect for Greek and Roman culture with his desire to be a strict Jew also? There are all sorts of reasons why he might have viewed the church of Peter, James and John as troublesome and in need of being crushed. But then he had his epiphany. There might not have been a light and a voice after all. Maybe nothing miraculous happened, but he certainly had a moment when something clicked in his brain and it made him change his mind. It also, according to his own account in Galatians, caused him to run away into the desert to think it all over. When he returned, he was talking enthusiastically about Jesus as a sort of spiritual entity that could enter your heart and renew you so utterly that you no longer needed to follow the law, but could have new life in the Spirit. He taught this faith to the Gentiles too, and it was Paul who started to add all those mystery religion elements. He even says that Jesus was hung on a tree, a statement more in line with the myths about Attis than anything to do with the literal crucifixion. So what was Paul's message? Well, it was actually quite revolutionary. When you apply certain mystery religion ideas to the Jewish faith, something remarkable emerges. When looking at Paul's ideas of atonement and redemption, I have an interesting interpretation. If God is good, then by letting us have free will so that evil can occur, he sort of symbolically dies so that we might live. Also, the whole point of having free will is that we can make mistakes and then hopefully learn better from them. In this way we know properly why things are right and wrong, good or evil. In this process we are symbolically resurrected, and so is God. Something like that anyway. And although what I say may sound wacky, it's not actually a million miles away from what Paul says in his letters. The law is death, he says, and Christ crucified becomes cursed in the eyes of the law. We die to the law and are reborn in the Spirit. These are paraphrases of Paul's words in the letter to the Galatians. The way I understand this is that learning right and wrong by rote, from a rule book, will never allow you to become righteous, because you don't fully understand why certain things are right and certain things are wrong. But through the free will that God gives us to do bad things and make mistakes, you can learn from experience what is right and wrong, and be elevated to a more enlightened, understanding point of view. You can have life in the Spirit. Of course, I don't think that Paul thought you have to do every bad thing to really become good, and neither do I. But it is part of a spiritual evolution, in a way, that following rules is not the way to righteousness, but rather being reborn through a kind of spiritual transformation. And that Jesus dying on the cross and then resurrecting is a symbol of our own death and resurrection when we awaken to the truth. Plus, it is also symbolic of the fact that God allows evil to exist so that we might have free will. And so, when we come to goodness, it is through genuine understanding and insight rather than simply obeying, zombie-like. I think Paul's teaching was quite revolutionary and insightful, but I think it quickly becomes buried due to misunderstandings from his far less educated converts. Eventually, Paul's attempts to liberate the followers of Jesus from needing to obey Jewish law and expanding it to Gentiles without converting them to Judaism brought him into conflict with some of the more militant Jews, and he was attacked in Jerusalem and had to flee to Rome. At least that's what the accounts in the Bible tell us. According to tradition, he was executed in Rome. The Gospels heap on the mythical, miraculous elements, but something of the original Jesus is also contained within their pages, at least in the Synoptic Gospels. It is possible that this is done with full knowledge of the symbolic nature of some of these stories in Mark and Matthew, but by the time of Luke's Gospel, it's become clear that the person writing it believes that all of these events literally happened. Eventually people believed that Jesus was literally God, that the crucifixion and resurrection was a literal redemption event rather than the atonement myth being a symbol of an eternal truth about God's grace and forgiveness, and Christianity as we know it began to take shape. At the same time there were the Gnostics, who went in completely the opposite direction. The convoluted theology of the Gnostic writers mixed ever more complicated elements of pagan mysticism into the mix, and they often portrayed Jesus as completely spiritual and disembodied, not really a person of flesh at all. This was all tied to Platonic nonsense about matter being evil and spirit being good, including that the Jewish God was not the true God after all, but an impostor and a kind of evil creator of illusion and sinful flesh. The original message, Jesus' attempt at a spiritual revolution for the Jews, and then Paul's profound insight, became lost in the controversies between these rival forms of the Christian faith. The rest is history. The literalists gained power in Roman society until the point when the Roman Emperor Constantine converted. Then the heretics and Gnostics were persecuted and suppressed until they disappeared from history. Neither side really had the truth anymore, and it is sad that between the unintelligent inability to understand metaphor and deeper meaning and the barking mad tendency to absorb convoluted mysticism and Platonic nonsense into the faith, that the original meaning was entirely lost. I'm not a Christian anymore, so maybe it doesn't really matter to me. I'd rather find what I need from pagan, Hindu or Buddhist sources. But to those who do still care, maybe it's possible to resurrect, see what I did there, the original and potentially revolutionary understandings that Jesus and Paul brought to the table and recreate Christianity in its original form. Food for thought. Anyway, thanks for watching. We're all different, we're all special. Snowflakes unite.